question of community has been at the heart of internet studies, and especially religion and the internet, from the early days in the mid-90s of looking at what is community online, how do we define or how do we understand these groups that are forming and calling themselves community online, to looking at the typologies and the kind of attributes of these groups, and merging into the issue of how do we understand community in an age of internet, both in online context and offline context. It's been a topic of much debate, and it's been a topic of many interesting research studies, and we have a great panel that's going to look at, from research and from a public policy issues related to community and the internet. I'd like to introduce the panelists. Our first panelist is going to be Scott Thumma. Scott Thumma is a professor of sociology and the director of IT, web, and distance education at the Hartford Institute of Religion Research. Scott specializes on megachurches, homosexuality and religion, the internet, and congregational studies. He's also the author of Beyond the Megachurch, the definitive work, at least to this point, on megachurches and culture, and published in 2007, and runs the website Insights into Religion. Our second speaker will be Ambassador Miguel Diaz. Ambassador Diaz was nominated by President Barack Obama as the 9th ambassador to the Holy See. In addition to this, he is a professor of theology at St. John's University and professor of theology at the College of St. Benedict in St. John's at the University of Minnesota. Diaz is co-editor of the book From the Hearts of Our People, exploring Catholic systematic theology, and author of On Being Human, named the best book of the year by the Hispanic Theological Initiative at Princeton Theological University. Diaz has taught religious studies and theologies at Barry University, University of Dayton, and University of Notre Dame, and will be bringing that experience to bear in his presentation. We'll also be hearing from the Right Honorable Stephen Timms, who is a member of Parliament for East Hampshire. Stephen Timms was appointed the Financial Secretary to the Treasury in October 2008. He has the strategic oversight of the taxation as a whole, including overall responsibility for the Finance Bill, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and the European and international tax issues. Since June 2007, Stephen has also been the first ever Labor Party Vice Chair for faith groups and is presently working with different faith communities across the country. And finally, our panel will round out with Lorne Dawson, who is Professor of Sociology at University of Waterloo. Lorne's primary area of research has been in new religious movements, with a specific focus in recent years on why some new religions become violent and the nature of charismatic authority, as well as the debate over how groups respond to the failure of prophecy. Lorne is also foundational in the early research related to religion and the internet, with being co-editor of the book Religion Online, which came out in 2004. He's done research on the social and cultural significance of new religions and religion online. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Professor Thumma to start us out in these presentations.
Thank you, Heidi. I much appreciated the chance to be here today. And with all of these scholars of the internet, I feel a little bit like a fish out of water. In some sense, mostly I study physical things, churches and denominations. But my earliest foray on the internet took place in the prehistoric mid-'80s, studying gay evangelicals in BBSs. These bulletin boards contained folk who were geographically dispersed around the United States and were often invisible to each other. They would never have connected with each other, let alone shared their faith or worshiped together, had it not been for the internet. What I learned from looking at this group doing religion and building their community shaped my perception of the role of the internet in creating space for religious persons to come together. Since then, I've been more interested in the use of the internet by physical churches and the effects this technology is having on their social dynamics. And my observations today are in this vein, that is, how the internet technologies have created space for these physical religious communities to come together in new ways and what effect that's having on their churches. Before tackling that question directly, allow me to rehearse some trend data over the past decade or so to show the adoption rates of these internet technologies And I'll do this very quickly, or as quickly as possible, but I have a handout outside, and it's also at the URL that you can see on the screen. First, the percentage of U.S. churches with websites across the past decade or so. You can see that in the past few years, the adoption rate has leveled off somewhere between 70 and 80%. And I think that's probably going to hold. However, if you look at their use of email to communicate with members, that has continued to rise, and I think that also will continue for some time. We're just beginning now to track other technology that are being used by congregations. Hopefully in the coming years we'll have some more trend data on this, but you can see that Facebook has in a very short time come on quite strong. Now the question is, how are these churches using their websites if 70 to 80% of them are doing it? Obviously, websites are there to attract potential visitors, but mostly when you ask these churches, their websites are there to communicate to their attendees, to their members. There's very little engagement of members through these sites. Occasionally there's a marginal interactive feature or some effort of community building, but for the most part it is one way. The same is actually true of their use of email. By and large, mostly it's used to disseminate information and to publicize congregational events. It's a slightly more interactive media, and you can see this most often when you look at the data on clergy and on members' use of email. This is a slide of the clergy use of technology, and the question was asked, in the past year, how have you done any of these things? And you can see there's a considerable use to connect or to distribute information, but also to connect with members, to interact back and forth between the clergy and their parishioners. However, when you look at what church members do online, for the most part, those folks who are in congregations using the internet are doing it with very specific, focused needs. They're trying to get a question answered. And their involvement on the internet, on the web, has very little interactivity. There's not a lot of folks who are doing religion online necessarily. But then when you look at their use of email, you get a different picture. Clearly, these worshipers are using email to connect with the pastor and with their church friends. They're not necessarily doing it specifically for religious purposes, and especially not as much as some research purports, but they truly are using this as a kind of interactive medium. So even with this usage at this point, clearly the internet is reshaping how church is done. And it's definitely more than I can address in 10 minutes, but one such way is that the space for religious community is expanding, the space for religious community to happen is expanding technologically. The internet is taking church beyond the physical limits of Sunday 9 to noon. And it does this by enhancing the functioning of the church. The congregation, the clergy, the worship, all has become much better, more efficient, more interesting because of technology. Likewise, it's expanding the worship service. It's creating an asynchronous congregation that's available 24/7 to the parishioners. It's also enriching the community. It's allowing church to happen outside the physical walls. And finally, it's transforming the concept of church through what I'm calling new synchronous communities. And two of these can be seen in the relatively recent inventions that have become popular, at least among the largest and most influential churches in the US, and they both directly relate to the internet. The first is the idea of multi-site congregations. where one single congregation is made up of multiple campuses, linked digitally in every way possible. Often the service is digitally broadcast in a live streaming feed. It clearly uses projection screens and all the high-tech features possible. This is changing our idea of what it means to be a church, and authority and all sorts of other questions as well. The other innovation is, and hopefully we'll talk about it some today, the idea of one of those sites, one of those locations being an internet campus. And you see any number of megachurches doing this. In the handout I have outside and online, I have a listing of about 50 different very large congregations in the country who are online with their services interactively. And then there are hundreds that also do live feeds and streaming with a little less interactivity. Yet with even these inventions, you see ministry as a technologically hybrid situation, a both-and solution rather than either they're physical or they're digital. It's not an either-or question at this point. Nevertheless, it is essentially a virtual expansion of the physical church and the physical church community. And having this technology really does make major differences, especially if you look at the churches who have employed technology to the greatest means, so that those that use the technology the most. What you see is that they're larger, they're more recently founded, they have larger percentages of young persons, they're led by younger clergy, they have more educated members, more resources, they're more likely to say their worship is joyful, innovative, spiritually alive, they use contemporary worship, they have a clear sense of mission, and most of all, they're actually growing. This technological function of creating new space for religious community does a number of critical things. First of all, it makes church more congruent with the everyday lives of members. Ordinary members' lives are enmeshed in technology. If their faith isn't also, then it's irrelevant in modern American society. Technology brings the interactive everyday world into the worship service by people texting feedback to the sermons, watching clips of the latest movie online, or getting live video feeds from youth out on a mission trip. Likewise, it makes members' lives richer with religious meaning. As we heard earlier, technology blurs what, when, and where faith and religious community happens. It's the medium to carry one's faithful living into everyday life, whether sharing prayer requests on Facebook, tweeting about sermons, or actually participating in online services. Likewise, in doing so, it enhances the number and depth of ties between members and solidifies their connections with the leadership and with the church programs. It reshapes the community and fellowship opportunities available on the internet with others in the congregation. And I think Facebook is an excellent example of this, but time doesn't permit. Ultimately, I think internet technology creates the space whereby faith can be more of an everyday lifestyle. But unlike a typically sectarian or fundamentalist encompassed religious lifestyle, the technologically enhanced faith is publicly accessible to anyone. Members are not necessarily overtly religious or intentionally doing faith online, but rather they're faithful people interacting online. And because of the medium's public nature, this results in a sort of accidental evangelism. So in sum, increasingly, technology is a necessary requirement for the faithful congregation in our contemporary world. It's absolutely clear from the research evidence that virtual congregational community is increasingly an essential component in the mortar between the physical bricks of many local congregations. And these congregations are thriving because of it. Thank you.
Well, I want to begin by bringing greetings from the Eternal City, and also by thanking the Tony Blair Foundation for this invitation to be with you this day. I've entitled my presentation, Human Identity, Diasporas, and the Internet. The Internet has revolutionized our notions of space and time by expanding our ability to relate beyond national borders. This new geocultural way of relating has opened up transnational opportunities that enable diasporas to produce and debate their histories, cultures, democratic aspirations, and communal identities. Diasporas have used the internet to mobilize demonstrators, revamp political processes, raise funds, debate issues, rearticulate values, and even influence the politics of governments left behind. This revolution in communications carries profound effects on culture, human relations, and national identity. As some have observed, the internet has changed the reality of daily life through what has been termed qualitatively and quantitatively enhanced linkages. These linkages allow immigrants and exiles to remember and keep alive cultural and religious traditions even when they're far away from their country of origin. Whether we speak about celebrating a cultural festival or a religious ceremony, making friends or finding a spouse based on shared cultural origins or religious background, or simply finding products that originate from a specific country or region of the world, the internet provides a way for diasporas to protect themselves against the disruptions to human identity that often accompany displaced populations. Internet technology has birthed a more globalized and transnational human being. This hybrid way of existing in between cultural, economic, religious, and political spaces de-emphasizes the role of geography in the formation of identity and collectivity and creates new possibility for membership across boundaries. Indeed, as is the case in many parts of the world today, many migrants maintain strong ties with their homelands, linked by travel, email, Skype, internet, and television. Diasporas live both here and there, constantly bridging geographical and temporal spaces. In any discussion of modern technology, it is crucial to underscore that humans are agents, and should be so. They should remain the subjects of their communal relations. It is not the internet that creates communities or diasporas. Technology is but one tool, admittedly an important one, used by people in the formation of both their self-identity and in the networking of their relationships. It is also important to recognize that technology, while increasingly becoming an essential means of modern communication, is not yet available in all places and to all persons. Social, economic, and political barriers in many parts of the world still hinder its availability. In his later years, Marshall McLuhan expressed concern about humankind's willful blindness to the downside of technology. He devoted a scientific basis for his thought around what he termed the tetrad. The tetrad allowed McLuhan to apply 4 laws framed as questions to a wide spectrum of human endeavors. In so doing, he provided a new tool for looking at our modern culture that includes, among other things, the issue of how the internet and communication technologies impact communities. The first question is, what does the technology extend? In the case of a car, it would extend the foot. In the case of a cell phone, it would extend the voice. The second question is, what does it make obsolete? Again, one might answer that the car makes walking somewhat obsolete, and the cell phone can make smoke signals and carrier pigeons unnecessary in our times. The third question he raised was, what is retrieved? The sense of adventure or quest is often retrieved with the car, and the sense of community returns with the spread of telephone service. Fourth question, what does technology reverse all of us to if it is overextended? An overextended automobile culture longs for pedestrian lifestyle, and the overextension of cell phone culture engenders a need for solitude. With the internet and advanced communication technologies, we have simultaneously access to events and information on the entire planet. However, for McLaughlin, the internet culture diminishes or amputates many of the close ties of community life once available to an oral culture that's assumed the need for physical, embodied presence. The simple act of booting up a laptop or turning on a BlackBerry can reduce a whole group of people to silence. Surely, while the internet and communication technologies can have negative consequences, this revolution in communications can also empower persons to become protagonists on a world stage. The recent events in Liberation Square in Cairo and in other parts of the world witness this fact. Secretary Clinton has some valuable advice with respect to the current debate surrounding internet and modern technologies. And I refer all of you to her recent comments on internet rights and wrongs, choices and challenges in a network world, delivered at George Washington University this past February. She writes, "There's a debate currently underway in some circles about whether the internet is a force for liberation or repression. But I think that the debate is largely beside the point. Egypt isn't inspiring people because they communicating using Twitter. It isn't inspiring because people came together and persisted in demanding a better future. It is our values that cause these actions to inspire or outrage us, our sense of human dignity, the rights that flow from it, and the principles that ground it. It is these values that ought to drive us to think about the road ahead. We hail from every corner of the world, live under every form of government, and subscribe to every system beliefs. And increasingly, we are turning to the internet to conduct important aspects of our lives. The internet has become the public space of the 21st century, the world's town square. To maintain an internet that delivers the greatest possible benefits to the world, we need to have a serious conversation about the principles that will guide us, what rules exist and should not exist, and why, what behaviors should be encouraged or discouraged, and how. So what does this all mean for our new communities or diasporas of migrants or religious groupings within the larger society? The eventual impact of technology requires a certain consent. It is human beings who create, accept, utilize, and critique every technology. Technology's impact, therefore, is always a permitted function. But this only applies when human beings exercise their God-given potential for rational and critical discernment and do not become enslaved to technology. We must all accept the fact that technology carries the potential to reduce and limit reason, choice, and to some extent, even human identity in the sense of the loss to embodied and interpersonal relations. The preservation of what is most authentically human must come above technology. In this sense, human freedom from acts that oppose in favor of those that advance the common good go hand in hand with the proper approach to technology. Only when I know who I am in constructive relation to others, and I know this as an ongoing process that takes a lifetime, am I capable of entering into the social reality that is our world in a complete way, in a human way. And this is where technology becomes an instrument, purely a means that I select and through which I can come to appreciate more fully my human identity. In and of itself, technology has no identity, no influence, no power other than that which I give it, that which I allow it to have. Let me conclude with some thoughts on a pluribus unum. The assimilation of a people or culture is not a good thing. Assimilation implies nullification of identity in the absorption and dominance of a culture by another. Alternative ways of understanding the coming together of peoples need to emerge. Our 21st century social makeup should be more about integration and interrelations than about assimilation and isolation. Rather than melting away human differences should be welcomed as a way to form a rich tapestry in which many different threads come together to create the beauty of the whole. E pluribus unum. Human efforts to isolate communities and melt away human differences should give way to increased relationship among peoples and commitment to affirm manifold and authentic ways of being human. In this age of interdependence, we should welcome the internet and other means of modern communication as powerful tools in the struggle to overcome the irrational fears of others and their otherness. Of course, as with any exercise of human power, the power of the internet must be used to build up rather than to destroy society. Over the centuries, the human family has made much progress. Still, much remains to be accomplished. Today, there are some legitimate fears that the shared foundations of civil societies have been weakened and undermined by prejudice, discrimination, and intolerance. The use of the internet to preserve and spread valuable religious insights and promote religious actions on behalf of the common good is an indispensable tool to protect the foundations of civil society. In undertaking our collective actions, we will undertake solid steps in our efforts to bridge national and transnational human difference. We must encourage greater parental involvement in schools, scientific innovation and cooperation, and investment in neighborhoods that provide more opportunities for cross-cultural experiences. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Stephen Timms. I'm delighted to be here. I'd also like to express my thanks to the Tony Blair Faith Foundation and to A&M University. And I want to raise some political questions around this topic. My credentials: I'm the Member of Parliament for East Ham in the East End of London, representing a constituency in which faith is both very prominent and very diverse. I'm a Christian. As has been said, I'm the Labour Party's Vice Chair for Faith Groups, very interested in the intersection of faith and politics. And I was Minister for Digital Britain in the last government up until the general election just a year ago. And I want to suggest this morning that faith is making a very positive contribution to our 21st century society. I recognise that some impacts of the internet might be seen to put some of those contributions at risk. But my conclusion is that the negative impacts will be more than outweighed by the positive impacts of the web on faith. The decline of faith has been a newspaper favourite throughout my newspaper reading life. And yet the impact of faith seems nevertheless to have gone up quite substantially, I think, over the last couple of decades. In the 2001 UK census, the voluntary question on faith, which was included in the census that year for the first time, showed about 3/4 of the UK population identified with one or other of the major faiths, 72% I think with Christian faith and 3 or 4% with the others. And I read one magazine article whose author was so startled by that finding that he thought people must have misunderstood the question. Actually, I don't think they did misunderstand it, but it is going to be interesting to see the figures in the new census, which also includes that question census that's underway at the moment. People say you ought not to mix faith and politics, and that if you do, you're asking for trouble, and they'll point to trouble somewhere in the world to underline their case. But I disagree with that view. My view is the opposite, that faith is in fact a very good starting point for politics, because faith is the source of values we need to make politics work. Responsibility, solidarity, patience, compassion, truthfulness. We need a lot more people, I think, coming at politics from a starting point of faith for the values that they will bring. And for the same reason, faith is a very good starting point for community involvement. Across Britain, we have fast-growing, extremely varied, I think very beneficial and profoundly important initiatives serving communities from a starting point of faith. And I don't think we yet really quite understand the scale and importance of this, but support for asylum seekers, debt advice, employment support, street pastors, youth work. Most of Britain's youth work is carried out by churches. The values which inspire those initiatives are priceless. I don't agree with the view that the profusion of faiths in Britain is undermining or will undermine cohesion. If you look at the community I represent, which is extraordinarily diverse in ethnicity and faith, it is characterized, I think, by a high degree of belonging. Let me just support my claim that our community is extraordinarily diverse. The Borough Police Commander told me recently that his officers surveyed all the people they arrested in the borough of Newham last year. At the end of the year, they came up with 172 countries of origin. Now, I think there are 192 countries in the UN, and those 172, that was just the people they arrested. Now, I looked through his list of countries, and Liechtenstein was there. Well, I think there are only about 50,000 people who live in Liechtenstein. Why one of them came to Newham and then got himself arrested, I don't know. But cohesion, it seems to me, is lost when people don't belong to anything other than their immediate family. In our community, the community I represent, a very large proportion identify with one or other of the places of worship. And belonging to that institution extends to a sense of belonging to the wider community. I was at a presentation this week by a supplementary school for children from Lithuanian families. That was set up by the Lithuanian Christian Church in East Ham. In the 2001 census, over 15% of respondents said they had no religion, but I noticed in our area it was less than 10%. And I think that is one reason why our community is in fact quite a cohesive one, it seems to me, because of a high sense of belonging. Cohesion doesn't require everybody to belong to the same institution, but it does require people to belong to an institution, to see themselves as members of something which is part of the wider community. And for many people, it is a church or a mosque or a temple. So what is the internet doing to those positive contributions to values and to cohesion? Faith groups, certainly, as we've been hearing, are using the internet creatively and effectively, and they've been doing it for a long time. Quite a long time ago, I recall bumping into an acquaintance going to work on the train. We were both commuting. We exchanged pleasantries. Then he said he was sorry he had to have his second breakfast, and he turned away and took out a black Bible and started reading from it. I had no idea what his second breakfast was, but that was it. Now, thanks to the web, you can do that much more discreetly these days on the train with an e-reader or an iPad or a mobile phone. And as Professor Cantini reminded us earlier on, lots of organisations will send you a different passage to read each day. I produce for the Labour Party a churches update 3 times a year, news from the Labour Party to the churches. The Easter issue is out this week. We want a dialogue. We distribute this via email. You subscribe at the faith page on the Labour Party website. A lot of people are rather surprised there is a faith page on the Labour Party website, but there is. And it means we can distribute it very quickly, effectively, and cheaply. And if you haven't signed up for it, and please do. The very gifted young woman with a bright future who attacked and stabbed me in my constituency surgery last May and is now serving a life sentence for attempted murder, believed she was doing her religious duty because I voted in the House of Commons 7 years previously in favour of military action in Iraq. She seems to have formed that view from sermons she watched on the web. And she also checked out, the reason she knew how I'd voted is because she checked out how I'd voted, and she checked out quite a few other MPs as well from the They Work For You website. A lot of people argue that the internet is undermining the positive contributions of faith. The internet's helping shift society away from groups and local solidarities and towards networked individualism that's been mentioned already. But to be fair, the move away from groups and local solidarity started long before the internet. Paul Teusner, former youth worker, now at the University of Melbourne in Australia, suggests that the values associated with the internet are freedom, intimacy, democracy, secrecy, isolation, and domination. Now, those are very different to the list of values I suggested earlier are inspired by faith. And online communities being built today, it seems to me, can never really substitute for actual communities, for being there. Nobody would suggest that a virtual pilgrimage, a visit to Mecca in Second Life, for example, could substitute for a real Hajj. And if I'm right that belonging to a worshipping congregation is key to a sense of belonging to the place where you live, then belonging to an online community which is not geographically specific, seems to me could never substitute for that. But notwithstanding those negative arguments, my conclusion would still be a positive one. Paul Teusner again notes the argument that, and I quote, Australia is creating a generation of loners who spend time in social media but at the expense of real connections with people and involvement in community. But like him, I'm not convinced by that argument. And he goes on to say, I, a lover of the internet, wonder if presence and connectivity, creativity and participation are actually thriving, but in ways that challenge political and cultural perspectives of older generations. If the web does have the capacity to isolate and to cut off, it also has the capacity to spread faith, to spread the values which faith instills, to keep people in touch with faith when physically separated. And it seems to me, on the whole, people are not seeing the web as a substitute. As Heidi suggested earlier, rather the web is a supplement, not a substitute. And understood in that way, the web can powerfully strengthen the positive impact of faith in our society. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and I'd like to thank as well, formally, I think it's really worth doing, the Tony Blair Faith Foundation and the University of Durham for inviting me here and for sponsoring this very interesting conference so far. My talk is going to be somewhat different from what we've heard so far on this panel. I'm just going to move here quickly to a simple little diagram. I intend to do two things. Just in 10 minutes, there's not a whole lot you can do. So I decided what I would do is just try and introduce some sort of things to think about. They're somewhat speculative, but I think there's some substance, or I wouldn't be presenting them. Now, when I was initially approached about this conference, this panel was supposed to be about diaspora communities. And so Ambassador Diaz and I also both worked with that notion. And so my comments will be about diaspora communities, but in a way that is generalizable beyond them as well. And I intend to initially just go over some of the material to some extent we've already covered. I want to summarize some of the lessons learned from the sociology of the internet with regard to religion in order to put a few ideas in place that then will support the speculations that I have towards the end of the presentation. So early on, when many of us more than a decade ago started studying religion and the internet, it became fairly obvious that this sort of triumvirate of concerns was going to be primary, and we've been hearing it throughout this morning. So issues of identity, community, and authority, and to recognize that these things are dialectically related, right? The changes and manifestations in any one of them was immediately having impacts on the other. And the internet as a medium, as a new medium, was introducing subtle changes on all three fronts simultaneously and in an interactive way. So we need to keep that in mind. Now, regrettably, the field did suffer And with the exception of a few scholars, some who are present here, it continues to suffer from a lack of really good empirical research, case studies, and even more importantly, well-organized quantitative and qualitative studies of some scope. I really want to compliment Heidi, because Heidi has really carried the banner on this count in some regards and is doing some very good research now, employing a large number of research assistants to be able to work on these projects. So regrettably, we're still working with excessively limited data. But from the data that the studies that have been done over the last decade or so, some of these conclusions are still true. And we've been hearing some of these already today, as I said. But I'm going to emphasize them again. When you're talking about things that are happening in the world of cyberspace, the first thing I would caution people is do not become overly enamored with various kinds of discussions that tend to hype up what can happen in the world, the online world. Studies, good studies, reveal that we're really dealing with continuity. People online and offline are pretty much the same. The identity that they have offline is the identity that they end up feeling comfortable with online. Social actions are very much the same. Norms that are operative offline actually end up being the norms that are operative online as well. And this applies to whether we're talking about this distinction between religion online or online religion. There is, though there's continuity, the medium itself does introduce subtle changes. And it's teasing out those subtle changes that I think seems to be the key to research in the area. And in that sense, Marshall McLuhan was referenced by Ambassador Diaz. His old statement about the medium is the message still tends to be a key insight. Not quite necessarily in the ways that Marshall McLuhan meant, but you do have to keep looking at the ways in which the technology itself alters our patterns of social interaction and our consciousness. And so quite some time ago I talked about a quiet revolution in religious sensibilities, and I think you can see that there is a change, fundamental change in religious sensibilities that is being facilitated by the sheer existence of the internet. But to keep with the theme of continuity, what also we need to do is always place the internet and the way in which religion is developing and changing in relation with the internet in a wider explanatory context. So you need to put it in terms of broader theories about changes in society. Myself, I've attempted to do that in terms of late modernity theory and globalization theory. So there's just a quote thrown up from quite some time ago where I was talking about this. So I'm going to do a little bit of these things today, but just a somewhat more specific lessons learned that I want to stress. What the internet does in particular is the internet as a medium really does act as a catalyst or accelerator. It's this process of the internet providing an incredibly large echo chamber for people's opinions, their views, their attitudes, their innovations that is really distinctive to the technology over all previous forms of media. This is related, of course, to these standard issues that have been referenced numerous times: the ease of access to the internet, the fact that it's global in reach, and the fact that people are using multimedia in connection to the internet as opposed to print media, etc. So it's easier to engage people, to have them become involved in what you're doing. The fact that it's interactive, you're not just broadcasting, you're actually in dialogue with people. And hypertextuality, which has not adequately been utilized, to tell you the truth. The question earlier about linearity, I thought was a very good question. And I believe that one of the biggest problems is that we are still too linear in the world of the internet, and the hypertextuality of the internet, that capacity is yet to be realized because people's consciousness, their sensibilities have yet to catch up with the potentialities of the technology. But that's just an aside. Now, this echo chamber effect, regrettably, means that the internet for a long time has really favored certain kinds of parties. It favors minority groups, meaning it allows groups that otherwise wouldn't have a voice to achieve a much larger voice. That can be good, it can be bad. It can be bad because the group that most often is a minority that seeks to use this echo chamber effect are critics. people who are critical of religious traditions, ex-members of groups, for example, seeking to galvanize support for their sometimes quite shrill responses to groups that previously they were, quite devoted to. And of course, this tends, like most media, to favor sensationalist accounts in some regards. So keeping those ideas in mind, let's turn to talking about diaspora community. And actually, I have no sense of time. I'm terrible on these things, so how am I doing? Okay. Like most professors, I could just keep talking and talking until someone usually yanks me from the stage. Okay, now, when the original title that was presented to us, and I had to get working on it, so I plunged right into it. So the original title had this phrase about reconnecting old communities, which is a logical assumption to make in a session about the internet and diaspora, and in ways that are obvious to all of us, right? The internet is an incredible device to allow people who find themselves in a condition of physical diaspora, separated from others, separated from their homeland, separated from elements of their tradition, to be able to bond together, to eliminate the barriers of distance and of time, and to sustain their communities in a certain sense. So that seemed a little obvious to talk about because it's, it's straightforward there. It's, I think almost everyone would be aware of that in certain regards. What I want to propose is that the subtle effects of the medium itself may be otherwise, and that as diaspora communities make use of the internet, their sensibilities are undergoing a subtle change, in ways that perhaps they are not fully cognizant of. And that is, I would argue that, again putting in a larger explanatory context, that the internet is very much linked into broader processes of social change at a global level that have to do with heightened individualism, which we've had some reference to, and of course increased processes of globalization. And it's this relationship between increasing emphasis on individual personal identity as the primary field of concern of people's attention in the context of an ever broader awareness of a global reality of your individual lives and of your society's lives that is really the key factor. And regrettably, again, tying it into the general insights, this means certain extreme positions gain advantage even with regard to diaspora communities. So there are two people I'm just going to use as sort of source points for ideas in this regard. One is Roland Robertson. Some of you may be aware of Roland Robertson, a sociologist that was one of the first people to start talking about globalization back in the early 1990s, a leading figure in globalization theory. Oh boy, okay. So quickly, I'm stealing an idea from Roland Robertson. He argues that when you're looking at the process of religion and cultural factors in the context of globalization, there are 4 levels of activity or identity that you have to differentiate: selves, societies, international relations, and humanity. At the time when we're talking about the emergence of fundamentalist and extremist traditions in the world that seem to coincide with globalization, they coincide with the new technologies like the internet associated with globalization, these fundamentalist or extreme positions are interpreted as a moral religious response to the failure or collapse of traditional social identities under the forces of new communication technology and globalization. And this can be interpreted as being true to some extent in terms of mainstream US with Protestant fundamentalism, Islamic societies, and other cases in terms of immigrant diasporas. But if you read Robinson closer, and I've speculated about this in the past, you've got to recognize this is not necessarily this response is not anti-modern. This response is in fact actually modern. And it's modern in ways that are related to the technology of the internet, though I'll have almost no time to explain. One is the internet, if there's one thing the internet promotes, it's reflexivity. The very use of the internet for individuals or groups compels a kind of reflexivity, a self-awareness that previous media doesn't. And even fundamentalist groups are then responding out of their reflexivity, their reflexive notion of the media, of their global context in formulating their ideas. So ideas that are pure reactionary aren't, because in their core they're really about heightened reflexivity, heightened awareness of the fundamental aspects of the modern condition. The second point is that in terms of these four levels, the media emphasizes individual identity, personal development, subjective states of being. It also emphasizes thematized global selves, reconceptualizations of humanity, which the internet as a medium heightens people's awareness of too. And what it does is it brings these two levels together. So you get heightened individualism, but a heightened individualism contextualized in a greater sense of the human condition, as never perceived before. Now this means in terms of diaspora communities, use of the internet in diaspora communities will, in ways the communities themselves aren't appreciating, shift attention away from their individual particularistic cultural groups towards more the formation of links between the individuals within their groups and a broader human condition.